And we are live, and I'm gonna get it for you. Okay, Ray, this is the engineer. Brother Leroy
Yeah, I'm
is
here.
Brother Leroy's here. We're already live on YouTube. We're going live on the radio. In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to Books That Matter, the program dedicated to promoting reading among all segments of the viewing audience. We thank the Most High for blessing us to be with you and you to be with us as we go on a journey into the pages of a new book, a very important book dealing with 9/11. The book is Unanswered Questions, and our guest on Zoom is Brother Ray McKinnon. Thank you for joining us, Ray.
I'm delighted to be with you, Brother Leroy. It's great to be speaking to you and all your audience in Harlem and beyond.
And the book is a very important book, particularly for grassroots people. I'm talking about people who may not necessarily follow the news, and those who do follow the news, whatever those news events might be. Those of us who were adults during the time of 9/11 remember the tragedy happening and seeing the towers come down over and over and over again. But we don't know that much about, if we know anything at all, about the families that were affected, beyond people who may have been in our own family, in our own neighborhoods. But beyond that, the families who were affected by the tragedy and who refused to take government compensation and pursued an avenue of exploring what happened on that particular day, the unanswered question. So here's where I'd like to pursue this interview with you and maximizing the information that we can get and the value of it for our audience. And that is the value, the significance of a commission relating to 9/11, the value of that commission, the intended value of it. And then I'd like to go to some of the questions that were unanswered by that commission. And then we go to how that commission got started in the first place based on the families pursuing that particular avenue, putting pressure and lobbying the government itself, if that's all right with you.
That's just fine with me.
Okay, so the value of the intended value of a 9/11 commission.
Well, I think that Kristen Breitweiser, whose husband Ron died in the South Tower, is said it best when she spoke before the joint 9/11 inquiry of Congress and the Senate in September of 2002, and she said to the lawmakers, we're going to get to the bottom of this, and we're going to make sure someone is held account responsible so that nobody ever has to walk in our shoes. This was like a massive failure of defense, a multi-layered defense system of the world's mightiest nation, ostensibly with 19 hijackers with poor piloting skills. And so they wanted to make sure that the government would learn the lessons, find out what went wrong, wherever that goes, without preconceived notions, but just ask the tough questions so that people can defend the nation in the future, make America safe.
Very good. Okay. And what I'm going to do is just touch on the beginnings of the question. Then you can give some of these questions that were unanswered by the commission. And then you can elaborate on the context of those questions, okay?
Okay.
Question to NORAD. This is Chapter 9.
Yeah.
Why weren't NORAD jets able to intercept the 4 planes?
Yeah, so that's an important question. Before I was born, back in 1956, there was a Grand Canyon mid-air collision with a commercial plane and I think a military plane. And 128 people died. There were a couple of other mid-air collisions that happened, I think, out near the East Coast in the following years. And the traveling public wanted to be assured that when they boarded a commercial flight to go anywhere in domestic airspace, that flight would not somehow crash into another plane and that they would all die, or many of them die. And so people put in place protocols. Now you have every plane before it leaves the tarmac. That those co-pilots have to speak to the air traffic control. They have to have an approved flight path. They have to have an approved altitude. Most of us who've been in a plane know this. We have to wait until we can leave the gate in order to go off on the plane to make sure that we're going to be on a flight that no other plane is going to crash into us.
Mm-hmm.
And so even if you have in the middle of your flight, suddenly there's some bad weather, hurricane, lightning storm. Even still, that plane, the pilots in that plane have to get permission from the nearest air traffic control to change their altitude to make sure it's safe to do so. And so you have now, in place, over the following 40 years, from 1958 until September 10th, 2001, you have cases where I would say, 10,000 or so times where the U.S. Air Force, whose motto is guarding the nation's skies, sends up fighter jets that are scrambled to go on either side of a plane that may be in distress. They have a graduated series of things that they may do, which may include even taking the plane down to the nearest tarmac, but it might not be the case they need to do that. But they check to make sure, is there a problem with the controls in the plane? Is there, a sick pilot? Is there a hijacking? Whatever. And they had been doing this with military precision, with thousands and thousands of planes over the many years. I remember reading a General Accounting Office report, which had to report to Congress on a yearly basis. I think between 1989 and 1992, over 1,500 cases where jets were scrambled to check on planes. And so this is being done, they're batting 1,000. It's not as though on a year-to-year basis they're getting like 3 out of 4 or 2 out of 3. They're getting every plane that they go up to scramble and intercept to check out things. But on September 11th, the families noticed that the government and the Air Force were 0 for 4. So why was that? And so that's their question there.
Very good. Why were these planes able to avoid radar?
Well, radar, which was initially created with the U.S. Naval Service, is all about being able to find objects that are at first at sea and then up in the air. And radar is very the Air Force, the FAA, they all have radar, and so they're able to track where a plane is at any given moment. And so there were problems with, like, why all of a sudden are people losing track of the planes? And there are a lot of technical arguments about this matter, but it seemed that the families were on solid ground to say it just doesn't add up. And so, what happened here? The Keystone Cops. Who's falling down on the job?
Very good. Question to Mayor Giuliani, unanswered by the 9/11 Commission. Why was the steel removed so quickly from the scene of a crime?
Yeah, this is, you've got, normally with a crime scene, many listeners will have seen if there's been a shooting or something else that's gone on, in a residential building or commercial building, corner grocery store, neighbor's house down the street. Suddenly you get often yellow tape, at least up here in Canada we do, and the yellow tape goes around to let everybody know that this is a police investigation and it's determined to be a crime scene. And so you don't move anything. And they have the forensic people go in and find out what they need to find out in order to build a case, or to do their investigation properly. But in the case of the debris from the World Trade Centers, uh, towers 1 and 2, all of the towers that were damaged, Tower 7 that fell late that afternoon suddenly. Uh, this debris was shipped off to South Korea, China, and other places very quickly. And there was the Fire Engineering magazine article, editorial with Bill Manning, who was outraged on behalf of many of the firefighters, saying, how can you do this? This is a farce to take away this really important information so that people can determine exactly how did the towers collapse.
Now, the questions that I'm asking as we get into the interview as to the background of the questions and the background of the families, these questions are basic that would normally be asked or featured in a newspaper. Wait a minute, you're removing the steel too quickly. Some questions would be raised, but at that time, Mayor Giuliani was portrayed as the mayor of the USA and all this other kind of hype. And these things that are basic would be missed by the common person. The radar, how come the jets weren't sent up to intercept? And this one, the materials removed so quickly. Another question to Mayor Giuliani was the World Trade Center building number 7. That's where he had him set up a command center for the police in New York City, and that collapsed even though it wasn't hit by a plane. So the question there was Mayor Giuliani, for the commission to deal with, how come that building went down in the same manner that the 2 other buildings went down that were hit?
And so you've got, the first, ever steel frame skyscraper was the 10-story Rand McNally building in Chicago in 1889. And the genius of deciding to build steel frame skyscrapers was that fire departments believed if you build a steel, certified steel frame building, that the steel's not going to burn and collapse. In a wood structure, this can happen. But if you have so you could build tall skyscrapers, and you could have numbers of buildings. In the years since then, there have been skyscrapers that are tall as World Trade Center 7, and they would burn for 24 hours in different countries, and yet they would remain standing. And so talking to several people in the fire department of New York, like Chris Joya with the Franklin Square and Munson Fire Department. He says, nobody expected that buildings would collapse, and certainly, here's the World Trade Center 7 collapsing. Nothing has struck it. So it's just again, no, most of us don't burrow down and start to ask questions about these things because we're not thinking about that. I mean, so often there are news stories that go on forever. For example, somebody might surface again as a story on section 3 of the paper, the question again about whether margarine's better than butter. And we're kind of dazzled by some discussion, and then we think about that again, and then it's gone, like in one ear and out the other. And so often we get fragments of information, but we don't get a whole picture to really make sense of things.
The last question that we're going to ask you is not the last question in the book. To ask you, and this is something that's hidden from or not apparent to the general public, and that is the put options, the betting on the stock of some of these airlines that were hijacked, that their stock would go down. Talk about that question not being answered by the commission.
Well, it's another excellent example of a question that needs to be addressed, and yet it's complicated because there's only I don't know, maybe I don't know how many percentage of people in America actually are investing in stocks and playing the stock market. I mean, maybe they have a pension fund that does, but often a lot of people don't. So that some people are familiar with buying and selling stocks, but these are put options, which has to do with putting money, betting that the value of a certain stock, American Airlines, United Airlines, is going to go up or down. And based on your bet, your option, as it were, is going to hope that the stock either rises or falls in the way you're hoping it will, so you can make a lot of money. And you've got one of the people who was involved in placing a lot of bets happened to be a relative of President George W. Bush, Mr. and Mrs. Wirt Walker III, a business partner of the president's brother Marvin Bush, and so he happened to be lucky enough to invest, get a lot of shares, and yet nobody thinks it's worth even asking him any question. The FBI thought we don't need to ask him any questions. I mean, and the FBI might ask somebody. Doesn't mean that person's a suspect, but just he's a lucky man anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And also these are does this mean foreknowledge is a question the families had, because why would you think to put these kind of trades up to 3 weeks before these airlines just happen to have these catastrophic involvement in the attacks, and then a bonanza for some.
And these are questions that were hoped to have been answered by the 9/11 Commission. Now, for the audience watching Books That Matter, and the book is Unanswered Questions, the value of the commission would have been to answer those basic questions, really going after and digging. So first of all, let's talk about how that commission came about as a result of families pushing for it. It was not an automatic commission that was set up relating to 9/11.
No, unlike the Challenger space shuttle in 1986 on the 28th of January, there was the space shuttle had its disaster, and on the 3rd of February, just 5 days later, President Reagan put together a commission to investigate what happened. A few people died tragically, but after September 11th, there was no signal from the president or the vice president, anyone in his cabinet, there was going to be any kind of investigation. Vice President Cheney suggested that there couldn't be any resources, any dollars spared for such an investigation that would give comfort to the terrorists, I think, to have any investigation. Busy with the war on terror, so we can't afford this distraction, I think was the word. And Senator Tom Daschle, the Senate's Democrat majority leader of the Senate, said that he was being pressured not to have any investigation. So that's going on. The families initially are reeling and grieving because they're going to funerals. So what happens is there's actually one of the prompts for all of this is that I think in October, the Congress and Senate are wanting to pass a huge bailout, I don't know, 15 billion, something like that, for the airlines. And at some point, somebody in Congress says, "Hey, I think we better give the families some compensation too, or it's just going to look bad." And so suddenly, the families are getting letters regarding, you're going to have to, be informed and have come and hear about the victims' compensation fund. And that's partly a catalyst for them beginning to meet some of the movers and shakers in Washington, D.C., who come to New York, especially, to tell them. And then also you've got families who, after the funerals are over, they're left with more and more questions. As they hear the news, there's gaps in what makes sense to them. And so a number of them start to, especially Mindy Kleinberg, Patty Casaza, Lori Van Auken, and Kristen Breitweiser, who are the September 11th advocates, end up doing a lot of research, looking at all the articles they can find in the library and reading the physical papers a bit before the online world. So they're doing that, and they come together with other groups. There's many different family groups that are forming, and by the spring of they're not getting anywhere at all. And so by June of 2002, they have a rally on the 11th of June in the Capitol. Joe Lieberman from Connecticut, Senator, Democrat, and John McCain, Republican from Arizona, are among the prominent lawmakers who lend their support, along with a number of other members of Congress. Chris Shays, I think, Republican in New Jersey, and so on. And so there's a building momentum. And after their rally in June, they end up, a number of them end up on MSNBC Hardball with Chris Matthews in late August, and then Kristen Breitweiser speaks before the joint 9/11 inquiry, Senate and Congress, and her testimony is a huge catalyst to getting the pressure in Washington, D.C. by members of Congress and the Senate. I think one of the people in the White House who was in the cabinet said there was a freight train coming, and we just had to get out of the way. So. So by but then even after that happened, then the president was sort of saying, yes, I'm going to do it, and then no, I think we won't do it. And then he got some more pressure and pushed back, and so finally in late November, he decided to go ahead and have the commission, and he appointed Dr. Henry Kissinger. And it's a very interesting story that a number of the families tell, especially it's featured in a documentary made in 2006 called 9/11 Press for Truth about some of these families. And Dr. Kissinger is now named the head of the commission. And so they go and visit his very nice offices up on, I don't know, Madison or Park Avenue. And he turns the thermostat up to as high as it possibly can go. Now it's late November, early December, so you're wearing your winter coat. And so mostly, like, there's 12 people on the family steering committee that have formed, one man, Bill Harvey, and the rest are women. And so the women are starting to peel off their coats and sweaters because, they're starting to, perspire in their foreheads. And a number of them have done some bat checking on Dr. Kissinger. And he's serving the family steering committee members coffee, tea, and one of them, I think Lori Van Auken, asks Dr. Kissinger, we're concerned about conflicts of interest, and we want to make sure that you don't have any clients by the name of Bin Laden. And so as the question leaves her mouth, Dr. Kissinger spills coffee all over the coffee table and starts to fall off the couch and blames it on a fake eye. And then resigns the next day. We don't know all of why, but we know that happened. So,
well, the joining in with you on the families, for the audience, as you read the book, these are people who didn't know one another, but they had the same notion of pursuing that which was not explained in the daily papers and magazines and news reports on TV. There were unanswered questions coming out of media and also coming out of the government. So they're meeting with Kissinger as a group of I would say ordinary individuals was extraordinary, and a lesson for other families who are affected by something. Could be mandates, it could be any number of things, but the fact is these families came together for the express purpose of getting the truth and pursuing the truth. So I wanted to interject that there, that, folks may say, well, these were middle class people, upper class. These were ordinary, what I call ordinary people who otherwise would have been going and share with us, give us, the flavor of these people and the dedication that they put after or during the time that they would run into obstacles from the government and elsewhere.
Well, certainly. It's a range of people. I mean, Mary Fetchett, who was up in, I think she's in New Haven, Connecticut, or Stamford, but she's in Connecticut. And she and Beverly Eckert, who lost her husband, Sean Rooney, formed this Voices of September 11th group, which has a lot of emphasis on memorializing the names, not forgetting the people's names, and helping people who are now on a healing journey with grief. Mary Fetchett, I think, said that before September 11th, she'd not been involved much at all in politics. Beverly Eckert, I think, is an accountant. Robin Weiner would be one of the people who more prominently involved in. She was involved in Washington, D.C. as a lawyer connected with giving legal and political, helping out with legal and political matters with members of Congress. But that's more unusual in terms of being closer inside the Beltway. Kristen Breitweiser is a mother of a 2-year-old, Patty Casaza was a nursing student, I think. Mindy Kleinberg, I think, was also a chartered accountant. So these are ordinary people who are thrown into all of this because of what is happening. Now, there are some people, as you mentioned, Beverly Eckert, Ellen Mariani, who decide not to accept the Victims' Compensation Fund and want to pursue their own separate legal days in court with the government. But many of the families said, we're going to accept the Victims' Compensation Fund, but notwithstanding, we want to have an inquiry. And so they, pursue, Bill Harvey, newly married. His bride, Sarah Manley Harvey, died. I mean, a month after they got married. So it's a heartbreaking story, and ordinary people. Sally Reagan-Hard lost her son Christian, who was just a probationary firefighter with the Fire Department of New York. Monica Gabrielle lost her husband Richard. I mean, people are living, ordinary lives, whether working class or middle class. Yeah. And they don't know, and they don't know all each other. They're meeting each other, pretty much for the first time.
And there's also the fact of those universal truths called the power of one person taking a stand and others joining on, or one person having resilience to stay in the game, and I use that term, the game of life, the challenges, and others gain strength from that individual. Talk about some of the individuals who otherwise we might miss, who gave strength to the group, who kept the group together.
Well, I think certainly, Patty Casaza, who lost her husband John. There's a choice. I mean, initially she's receiving, from her friends and family members. They want her to just get on with grieving and healing, and telling her not to be concerned about questions and not to be reading different articles and finding that the articles don't seem to come together in a way that makes sense. They want her to just move on and don't worry about the questions. But, she's saying, no, I need, in order for me to come to peace and to really heal over what's happened, I need to ask these questions. I need to find out what happened. Lori Van Auken, I mean, she remembers, being, at, in the living room of, in her home, and she finds out, she's asked to turn on the TV, and then, she says, as I continue to watch the breaking news, they showed the president sitting in an elementary school classroom, juxtaposed with footage of black smoke coming from the World Trade Center, along with the people jumping to their desks and burning buildings. I screamed at the television, "Get up, President Bush. get up and do something. But he remained seated in a classroom of small children as I watched Andrew Card whisper something to the president, and yet still my president remained seated in a classroom of small children when our country was so obviously under a terrorist attack. In between panic and hysteria and hoping my husband would get out of the World Trade Center alive and wondering how I'd ever break the news to my children, I wondered why the Secret Service was letting the president stay in the classroom full of children. Why didn't they whisk him away? It seemed every target in America was being attacked. So wasn't the president, the leader of the free world, in danger of being attacked? Well, weren't the children in the classroom with the president in danger too? I think that a lot of, the reactions, like they all know where they were. I mean, we all know, but they know where they were on September 11th. They know their reactions to what happened, their grief, and they know the questions that were just rising, deep inside their bellies, asking for answers. And so I think that for all of them, what fueled and formed, began to coalesce was their own unique reactions. And then they found among one another, the dozen of them, they found they were peers in this experience. And so I think that common experience just drove them to coalesce.
Very good. This program, ladies and gentlemen, today is Books That Matter. Our guest on Zoom is Ray McKinnon. The book is Unanswered Questions Put to the 9/11 Commission. So here we have a 9/11 Commission story that we'll continue with in a few minutes. It's 2001 that this event takes place. The attack on the World Trade Center takes place. This book is a new book. Your book, Unanswered Questions, is new. How did you get involved? What led you to being involved? And how did you track down the family members? And what was their reception to your inquiries as to whether they would give you interviews for the book?
Well, my own story starts in a different place than many. I was, I live in Vancouver, Canada. I was at a retreat in Joshua Tree National Park, along with 60 Americans from across the USA, in a desert with saguaro cactus and jackrabbits and no TVs and no radios. I'd been for a walk early in the morning at sunrise and saw a plane fly overhead heading east out of California somewhere. And I went back to a 7 a.m. stretching and meditation session. And in the middle of that, in came a leader of the program who asked people to stand in a circle and told us that there had been this dreadful thing that had happened. At that point, planes have hit the North and South Tower, and the Pentagon has been hit. I don't know if they knew yet about a fourth plane, but in any event, we're told at that point, and there are people who are sobbing and shrieking. Two people in the room had a financial advisor who managed their stock portfolio, who worked in one of the Twin Towers. So it was very immediate. And then, because all the planes were grounded, I didn't get back to Vancouver, Canada for about 5 days. I took finally a bus out of Seattle and took 3 hours at the border to get back across into Canada. So, for me, life, I heard former Foreign Affairs Minister, Canadian Foreign Affairs Minister Lloyd Axworthy give a talk at a public library and said he thought that if Osama bin Laden is the person who's done this, then there should be a police and intelligence response and not going to war. But anyway, off came the war in Afghanistan and then the war in Iraq, and things just sort of carried on. And the 9/11 Commission itself was not well reviewed or reported at all up where I live, except for Condoleezza Rice's cameo appearance. I knew nothing really about it. So I just happened to come upon a book in 2007 called Wake Up Call, The Political Education of a 9/11 Widow, written by Kristen Breitweiser, And she talks about her husband Ron, who died, and their relationship. Talks about how Ron Breitweiser was a great fan of Dick Cheney's, how she and Ron had voted for the Bush-Cheney ticket in 2000. And of the family members, I don't know what all of them may have said in public, but from what I've been able to find out, at least of the five that I know of who've said something about how they voted in 2000, 3 out of 5 voted for Bush Cheney ticket. So conservative people in many ways. So I was astonished that here I was 7 years or 6 years after the attacks, and that the mainstream media that I followed had really not brought to my attention that there were families that were ever involved in pushing for an investigation. And so I began to look at their website, the Family Steering Committee's website, looking at their questions, looking at their press releases, following up with a few different books, Paul Thompson's The Terror Timeline in particular, and reading eventually several thousand articles that I could see. And initially it was just a file, and I was kind of just learning about what it means to live in a post 9/11 world. And then around 5 or 6 years ago, I just thought, nobody ever talks to me about, I mean, they talk about 9/11 maybe sometimes, but they never talk to me about the families and what they did. And I thought, Kristen Breitweiser published her memoir in 2006 or 7. A few other people, Jeanette McKinley, published a memoir called Fortunate, a personal diary of 9/11, which is now out of print. A few other books, Bob Kemper, in his book Rubble, talks about the family's resilience. But when it comes to discussing the 9/11 Commission and the Family Steering Committee, he just gives a couple of paragraphs in his whole book to that. So I thought that there needed to be, at least one more book that highlights. I mean, I think that these people, who were on the Family Steering Committee should be, household names or something. They should be people we know about, or students in grade 12 could learn about them, but they're not. I mean, unless you happen to watch a PBS special with Gail Sheehy, you wouldn't know. So I decided about 6 years ago to try what I could do, and I wanted to write a book. There are quite a lot of books about September 11th, and a lot of them are I would call pretty hardball, left brain politics or history books. And I wanted to write a book. I've taught a lot of writing workshops about poetry, memoir, helping people write new psalms of their own for their own spiritual devotion. And I thought, if I want to write a book, I want to write a book that the people who've been to my workshops can read this book. They're not, the people who come to my workshop generally are not academic people. So they're going to get bogged down if I have too much dense material. I'll have to deal with some of it, but I can't cover it too much that way. I need to, and I thought the way to do a book that I would want to write is to layer all of the chapters with quotes, with testimony, with what Monica Gabrielle or Sally Reaganhard had to say to the 9/11 Commission. Right. What Lori Van Auken and Kristen Breitweiser say in an editorial in the Newark's Star Ledger. Let people hear their voices. I mean, their voices are what's really important. So when it comes to someone like me, I'm not a journalist. I don't have, I mean, maybe people working in the New York Times or the Washington Post or Boston Globe have a kind of an in to people's phone numbers and emails, or addresses. I didn't have that. I could maybe try and do a search, but I mostly didn't have a lot of access. I did find some emails and some phone numbers, and I wouldn't get a number of them replied to. I mean, I did speak to a handful of family members, and it was very moving to speak to them. Bob McIlvaine, Matt Campbell, and a few others. But mostly I had to rely on just what's there in open source material. I had to watch Mindy Kleinberg's testimony. I had to watch Mary Fetch's testimony and get a feeling of the tone of their questions and the tone of what they would say when they were interviewed, and what they wouldn't say. And I think that one of the things that was interesting is that Mindy Kleinberg said, about the whole experience with the 9/11 Commission. She was always hopeful that the commission and the government would answer her questions, and that's kind of a hopeful tone that's there throughout. In the it's only as the families begin to go through this experience. Lee Hamilton is a Democrat, a former Democratic member of Congress, and I probably would have thought, okay, great, he's a Democrat, because I might be more inclined to vote Democrat. But then I find out he's been a best friend of Vice President Cheney, a best friend of Donald Rumsfeld, often, holidays together, was involved with the Iran-Contra inquiry, thought that it would be impossible to imagine Oliver North ever lying to him. So it seems that there's, he might not have been the best choice if you want someone who's impartial and independent, truly independent, to investigate. If you've got best friends in the cabinet that maybe don't want you to investigate certain things.
Well, there are a number of lessons in the book. As one reads the book, there are situations that require the reader to analyze or to pick up on cues in the book. And the Hamilton comes up in your book when the commission is finally put together with a budget of something like $3 million, which was that was tissue money. However, Hamilton and the former governor of New Jersey are put together as the co-heads of the committee of the commission. Talk about Zelikow, and in your chapter, you say the commission had two goals, immediate goals, initial goals, and that is to respond to the families, the 9/11 families, and to select a head who would be a force, and not a head, but a director who would be a force in bringing the truth out. I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah.
But what happens after that sentence? You lay out how the selection of Zelikow, how his selection goes directly against the being responsive to the parents. So let's go through that chapter.
Sure. So, it's the, Tom Keene is, involved with a consortium of interests in getting the pipeline through Afghanistan. That's another conflict of interest. I don't know if I mentioned that in the book, but like there's so many things. And Lee Hamilton's close relationship with the vice president and secretary of defense, and then you got Philip Zelikow, who's written a book with Condoleezza Rice before. He's also been key in as an architect of articulating a paper to understand preemptive war as a doctrine, going to war in Iraq. And so this starts to play in as the 9/11 Commission starts rolling. Some of the first people who are brought to the 9/11 Commission to speak are Dr. Lori Myroy. I don't never know how to pronounce this person's name, but who's convinced that Iraq attacked on September 11th, and another person, Abraham Sofar, who's also talking about this. And so the families are saying, what's going on here? We think that there needs to be an investigation into the attacks on September 11th, the 9/11 the joint 9/11 inquiry of Congress and the Senate concluded that Iraq had nothing to do with this. So why are you spending our precious time in public hearings, of which there were only 18 days over 20 months? Why are we spending precious time having people come before the commission to do a sales pitch for the Iraq War? And also, Executive Director Zelikow and Senior Counsel Ernst May write a outline for the 9/11 Commission report in March of 2003, before the inquiry gets really rolling. And what's interesting about that outline is that all of the chapter headings and subheadings seem to mirror almost word for word most of the chapter headings and subheadings of the report that was published in July 2004. There was a parody done of this when many of the 80 staff of the 9/11 Commission learned about this outline over a year later. They did a parody about it, about how it was predetermined what the commission would find. And so there was some concern on the part of families and staff themselves that the executive director is encouraging people to look under some rocks but not others. Max Cleland, who was a senator from Georgia, who was on the commission, resigns in disgust in late November 2003 because of the lack of tenacity on the part of the way the commission is with all the softball questions. I think there's even questions to people commenting on how nicely they're dressed. And commissioners have 5 minutes each for each witness that comes for about an hour. And so to spend any time at all flattering the witness or saying, I remember what it was like growing up in such and such a place. This kind of non-urgent banter is just infuriating for the family members who want them to ask the urgent questions. And so, Philip Zelikow is directing and he's also talking to Karl Rove, senior White House counsel. And it seems that there was quite a bit of interest on the part of the White House that whatever the 9/11 Commission report published, that it would not publish anything embarrassing to the president, especially in an election year when he wants to be reelected.
Talk about the minors, MINDERS, the minors who were positioned during the hearings for any witness who would come from a particular department.
Yes, so people are witnesses from different Defense Intelligence Agency, Central Intelligence Agency, Pentagon, Federal Aviation Administration, others. And they're coming before the 9/11 Commission, not generally as part of a public inquiry, but there are, I think, 8 staff teams that the 80 staff are divvied up into. And they're hearing people speak behind closed doors, mostly. But even still, in that rather protected arena, a staff person from one of these agencies is being asked questions by the 9/11 commissioners, and they will have someone senior to them from that department who is seated beside them or standing behind them, perhaps putting their hand on their shoulder or making other gestures. Or when a commissioner asks a certain witness a question about something, the minder will answer the question for the staff person. And the lack of protection for these people meant that they're thinking not just, what can I tell the commissioners here that's the God's honest truth, but what can I tell the commissioners here, given that my senior boss is beside me, that won't get me in trouble with my department. And so that really colors the way in which people didn't feel free to say what they might say otherwise.
So that particular chapter shows a blueprint for others how a commission or committee is sandbagged, how it's structured to go in another direction as opposed to the direction that the name of the committee or commission has.
Yes, I mean there were Patty Casaza said in a talk at a college in Hartford, Connecticut, 2007, I think, that there were numbers of whistleblowers that would come up to her and Mindy Kleinberg, Lori Van Auken, Monica Gabrielle, Kristen Breitweiser, and others. And they would say, we need the 9/11 Commission to subpoena us to come and testify. A subpoena would give those whistleblowers protection so that they're not going to be put on the bad end of some kind of political dynamic back in their department. And they would say, we have information. Sabella Edmonds said, I have information. And she actually was one of the few whistleblowers that did testify before the 9/11 Commission behind closed doors. She apparently told them, as she said since, that she said that the government knew ahead of time the date, September 11th, the method of attacks, the planes, and the targets, the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Now, somebody may say, well, that's what she has to say. Maybe there are other people who might be brought forward to say, no, that's not true. But whatever the case, instead of having her testimony, which was before the 9/11 Commission behind closed doors, find its way into the report, it never got there. So there's ways of burying information and burying testimony that you don't want people to know about.
Before we conclude with how folks can acquire your book, I want to key in on the last thing you said, burying, how information can be buried. Talk about the individual, I believe his name is Thompson, that the family met. He, we call him an investigative journalist. He had all these clippings and the difference that it made in their quest to pull together information that they would use at a 9/11 commission.
Yes, Paul Thompson is one of the people who's a hero in the story of the investigation, because he put up a complete 9/11 timeline website, which is now renamed historycommons.org. And on his website, the families had been amassing binders with physical copies of different news articles from different papers. However, Paul Thompson would have an article, and then you have links to other ones that you could quickly see. So that this all helped them to be able to then formulate the most important questions to ask the 9/11 Commission with enough. Often their questions were also included references to different newspaper articles, so that the 9/11 commissioners could see where the families were coming from and what was giving them reason to ask a particular question. And so Paul Thompson had researched over 5,000 different news articles. And so it was a great service to the families that he did that.
And within that particular section, you point out how the families learn of a technique or how to critically assess a newspaper article or magazine article. That is, the page one you thought was the most important article, but buried further in the paper was an article of more information and more valuable. Just give that for the audience, because it's a principle that is evidently used in journalism to tell the truth without telling the truth.
Well, that's right. there may be an assumption that many of your listeners have, and I may have had it too at times, that on section A, on the first page, the headlines on page 1 in the newspaper is the most important story that I need to know about, and that's the one that I should read to be up to date as a citizen. But often it was the case that the story on page B12 or page E17 was the important story. I mean, one of the very important stories is a question about reports of explosions in the towers, in the buildings. And the families simply said, Patty Casaz's husband, John, said, I think that there are bombs going off here in the North Tower. They didn't have any accusatory question about that. They just said, can you find out about that? And so it happens that in the fall and winter of 2001, 503 first responders, firefighters, and EMT were interviewed by the fire department of New York. And eventually, after the 9/11 commission was over, although there were often FBI present at those interviews, the families in the New York Times pressed the city of New York to release that testimony. And so they did do an article on the 12th of August in the New York Times about this testimony. However, if you want to see the testimony, you have to go to a link that was put online on the 12th of August 2005. And then you can find the great challenge of reading through nearly 12,000 pages of the 503 people's testimony. I did that one day at a time as a kind of a devotion. But it's overwhelming and immense. If you begin to think, where am I going to start? I started with the letter A and went on. But of those, 118 mention bombs or secondary devices or explosions. I don't judge who's responsible, but I think that it's pretty compelling if you have over 100 first responders saying that they encountered and witnessed things like that. It should at least be investigated, whatever it means.
That story doesn't even exist in the knowledge of folks who walk up and down the street, or even maybe on, the family B first responders. That's I did see a video clip where the guy's saying, "Boom, boom, boom." He goes like this. He's with 2 or 3 other firemen. This was shown during it's a clip that does exist, a video, and he was saying the fireman was saying he wasn't in uniform. Well, he wasn't in outside uniform. He was in his looked like they were in the house, but very, very good. I see the book as a salute to the families, and within that are principles on how others can organize for situations that may not be or wouldn't be as catastrophic as the World Trade Center, but definitely would use the fact of families working together for a common cause. And that is a theme that I saw in your book. And also, it's the first time that I'm hearing of a book that salutes, I use that term, salutes the families for what. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, and I had to write the book carefully because the family steering committee itself are not all on the same page in the years that follow. The release of the report and the fact that only 9% of the questions were dealt with any seriousness caused some fragmentation, I think, with numbers of families, maybe half of the people on the family steering committee variously pressing for some new kind of investigation, maybe because of Saudi Arabian or Pakistani complicity, or worse, some sort of complicity within the US government. And then there's others who, Carrie Lemack has spoken, whose mother, Judy LaRock, died in the plane. She's made a documentary short, Academy Award nominated film, Killing in the Name, about Islamic terrorism. and is absolutely convinced that Osama bin Laden is responsible. Mary Fetchett's very critical of the Port Authority and evacuation procedures, but I think very satisfied with the official story and was also involved with the 9/11 Museum. Carol Ashley, very critical of the lack of warning of ordinary Americans on September 11th, given numerous generals and other politicians seemed to get a heads up not to fly that day. And she's also very concerned about mass surveillance, but I think she would probably accept the official story. So there's a range. And so I try and leave the reader, I just give them the information here, and they can decide, whether they think that it was a surprise attack, whether there was foreknowledge and people let it happen, or worse. But certainly there are still families who are asking for a new investigation for their own peace and healing. And I think it's worth knowing, even 20 years later, that struggle by a minority goes on.
Especially in light of Afghanistan today, especially in light of the pullout from Afghanistan. How can people acquire your book?
Well, they can order my book, Unanswered Questions, from their local bookstore. It's available in both hardcover and paperback. They can get it on paperback on Amazon and ebook on Amazon. And they can follow me on Twitter at Ray McKinnon #7.
And I would recommend to the audience that you pursue 9/11 as a reading group. A reading group would get a copy of Ray McKinnon's book. Another would get a copy of another book relating to 9/11. A third would get a third book relating to 9/11. And then those 5 individuals would get together every other week and report to one another what they've read in the various books, compare notes. It's a way of reading 5 or 6 books at one time, in a way. Ray McKinnon, thank you very much for your work. Thank you for your dedication to helping the stories of the families get to the public, and much success to you.
Well, thank you, Brother Leroy, and much success to you and to all of your readers and listeners.
Thank you. And to the audience, remember, try to find a child within your own family to give a book to read, and also senior citizens, if you would take time to read to a senior citizen. God bless you all, and have a wonderful and excellent year.